Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you had a great lunch, and thanks so much for joining us for this afternoon's program. It is my pleasure. So my name is Hugh Thompson. I'm a member of the Aspen Cyber Security group, and this next topic is such a critical one. The attacks against OT and critical infrastructure have continued to grow, both in frequency and severity. And so we have an excellent discussion for you now, moderated by the incredible Vivian Schiller, Executive Director of Aspen Digital. Vivian.
Thank you. My publicist, ladies and gentlemen. As you said, we have a really interesting and important topic today. So as many of you remember very well, it was a year and a half ago that the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attacked and really revealed the vulnerability of our infrastructure. Notably, it was also the first time that the public viscerally felt the impact of a ransomware attack on their day-to-day lives in the form, as you know, of long lines for gas. I don't think it really had, this is the first time, ransomware and cybersecurity breaches probably penetrated the consciousness of many. It also shined a really, really bright light on the need for collaboration between government entities and private industry to communicate and to cooperate. So on this panel, and I'm going to invite my panelists out now, we're going to talk about what we've learned since then and what we should worry about next. So we are incredibly thrilled to have just the right people to have that conversation. Immediately to my left is Alan Armstrong, President and CEO of Williams, the energy infrastructure company that serves 30% of the U.S. natural gas volumes, and David Pekoske, Transportation Security Administrator, a role that he's held since 2017, leading a workforce of over 60,000 employees responsible for security operations at highways, railroads, mass transit systems, and pipelines. So I just want to be really clear here. We have the regulator and the regulated sitting here on stage.
Both smiling.
Yes, smiling peaceably. I warned them that I was going to quote from Ghostbusters by saying, it's like cats and dogs living together. So very much looking forward to this conversation. David, I'm going to start with, sorry, I'm going on first name basis with everybody. Hope that's okay. So I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking, okay, airports, TSA, got it. That's how most of us usually experience TSA. And by the way, we're going to come back at the end to a very important airport TSA question, but I'm going to hold that.
Okay.
Airports, railroads, highways, mass transit, all of those things have something in common. Pipelines?
Pipelines. So TSA was formed in the Department of Transportation back in 2001. I was telling the luncheon audience that we were formed by law 69 days after 9/11. So you think of how quickly that occurred in the whole scheme of government process. And essentially what Secretary Norman Etta did at the time, the Secretary of Transportation, is he looked across all of his DOT modal administrators, so this would, except for the FAA, and basically took all the security functions from them, and then looked at the FAA and took all their security functions, moved it over to TSA. TSA was home ported in the Department of Transportation for our first 2 years. And so that's the reason why, when you look at the DOT safety agencies now, there's an exact mirror in TSA of the authorities on the security side.
Yeah. Although pipelines, of course, don't have humans traveling through them, so it's certainly a different.
But they have product.
They certainly have a product, which gets us to you. So, what is it like for the pipeline industry to be considered, a part of TSA's remit and regulated by TSA? How's that working out for you?
Yeah, well, certainly, the pipeline industry is regulated today in a lot of different branches of the government. And I would say that this has been as constructive of an effort as I have ever seen between government and industry to actually bring impact to making sure that we are doing everything we can to keep our industry safe. And so I would just tell you, when this first started, all of us in the industry kind of went, oh boy, here we go. This is really going to be rough and ineffective. But it's been highly effective. It's been very collaborative. And I hope that, the questions that come out of this is how can we take that same model to other areas of regulation of our industry as well, because it's really been a journey that didn't start out, perfectly smooth, but I would just tell you, thanks to, and I hate to do this because it is the regulator. It's like telling the head of your comp committee how smart he is, but
that can be effective.
but seriously, it's been very much Administrator Pekoske's leadership that has said, hey, we're going to listen. We both have things to learn from both sides, and he has really brought that culture to an organization that was there first to regulate and enforce, and not always in the posture of listening and trying to do that effectively. But it's been remarkable to me how quickly he's brought that culture into that organization.
I do want to come back to Colonial Pipeline in a minute, but this really does beg a question, because if we're talking about this, that's a very strong statement that you made, how well this has worked out, and indeed how important it would be for that same kind of relationship and effectiveness to be applied to others. So you mentioned some of them, but what are the hallmarks of what made it effective? You mentioned listening, which is always a good thing, but what else from both of your perspectives?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say what's made it effective is the desire on both our parts to learn. When we initially rolled out some very prescriptive cybersecurity requirements for the pipeline sector, right after the Colonial Pipeline incident, we knew that we were rolling things out that were more prescriptive than we generally would like to be, but we needed to get some baseline improvement in the overall cybersecurity of that very critical sector in the country. But we heard loud and clear from the industry that, hey, we'd really like to do this a different way. Candidly, so did we. We always wanted to get to the position where, rather than being incredibly prescriptive in our regulatory processes, we got to be more outcome focused. And one of the things that has always been clear to us is that our private sector partners, the regulated parties that are under our remit, already have cybersecurity procedures in place. And what we didn't want to see happen was for them to just cancel out everything they were doing and put in what we had prescribed. Right. Additionally, and it's been raised a couple of times in the sessions this morning, this is a rapidly developing field. And so we wanted to provide some flexibility in the regulatory regime so that we didn't have to reissue a new regulation every time a technology changed or every time a company found a much better way to achieve those security outcomes that we put out together. It was a very collaborative approach. The other thing that I think is critical on this is thanks to the great work that the Department of Homeland Security had done for many years in the National Programs and Protection Directorate, and then that soon became the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We saw this manifested a lot during the COVID-19 responses. They determined a way to identify the national critical functions. And that tool has been very helpful to us to then say, hey, within the pipeline sector, you have 3,000 companies in the US pipeline sector. Do you need to have prescriptive, even though outcome-based requirements across 3,000 companies? The answer in our view was no. And so out of the 3,000, we ended up covering in our security directives fewer than 100 because we felt, along with CISA, that these were the most critical to the smooth functioning of that critical infrastructure sector.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the legacy of Colonial Pipeline. As you mentioned, this is a fast-moving space, and a year and a half is, in dog years, may as well be a decade and a half of changes. So is there anything, first of all, is there anything we know now about the attack that we didn't know in the immediate aftermath? And what has been what has changed in the aftermath of Colonial Pipeline?
Well, I'm not going to speak for Colonial Pipeline on this, but I will say that the learnings that were made available were very important to understand within the pipeline industry that there's IT controls, so your SCADA systems, the broad systems that remotely control the pipeline operations. and systems that are scheduling, your customer scheduling, and the IT. And then there's operational technology at the local level where you have programmable logic controllers that operate the local pieces of equipment and the local control on the facilities. Both of those things have to be protected. And in the case of Colonial, it was more at the broader system level, but there really wasn't knowledge when that attack was first made. They didn't really know to what degree of controls they had infiltrated on that, and so they acted out of abundance of caution in their activities on that. And so I would just say that, I don't think the industry saw that as an extremely sophisticated attack by any stretch of the imagination. And there's certainly been more sophisticated attempts since then. So I would just say we learned it wasn't very sophisticated, but if you don't have a plan in place to determine how far it's gone and where it is, that is one of the things that I think the industry learned, which is to be extremely well prepared so that you can learn very quickly how far it's been infiltrated in your control systems.
So how's it? I want to come to you in a second, but I just want a quick follow-up on that. So after it happened in your company, what was your immediate action in terms of trying to examine your own systems?
Well, the first thing we wanted to do was, as quickly as possible, learn from the incident, learn what had occurred. And I would say that is one of the things over the last 2 years that we've made a lot of great progress on across the industry, is that the speed of intelligence has to improve, and it has improved. And so the critical intelligence about what happened there's been a lot of other critical pieces of intelligence that the NSA and those organizations have shared, CISA have shared, that have been very effective at us defending ourselves. But I would say the first thing you have to do is actually learn from it. And in this case, we didn't really have, if you think about it, we didn't have the protocols in place for sharing information across the industry at all at that point in time. And so that's one of the things that's been established that's much more effective today.
Together with the TSA, presumably.
Yes, right.
Yeah, and I would agree wholeheartedly with what Alan just said. One of the things that when Colonial first happened, we put 4 requirements in place immediately. One was to report cyber incidents to CISA, not to TSA, to report to CISA, because one of the things that we're trying to do within the executive branch is, rather than having 5 or 6 federal agencies all calling that CEO in the midst of an event, to have one lead, and then have all the reporting go to one location. So
and
the
that
company,
was CISA.
That was CISA, because we view CISA as the clearinghouse for cybersecurity information within the executive branch. So I think that was very effective. So it was reporting, establishing a cyber point of contact that's available 7/24. So when there was an incident, we had somebody that we could call reliably to speak to that incident. The other was to do a vulnerability assessment, and then to have a contingency plan to be able to respond. So that planning piece is absolutely critically important going forward. A couple of other things that we saw too, and one of the things that we did very uniquely with pipeline cybersecurity, and then rail cybersecurity, and now aviation cybersecurity, those requirements have not yet been issued, but we will have some cybersecurity requirements for the aviation sector in the not too distant future, was to invite the chief executive officers of those most critical companies, in this case, in all 3 of those cases, into the White House for a top secret briefing on the threat, because we felt it was very important. This was enabled by the National Security Council. It was very important for the CEOs to see the why. Why were we reacting the way we were, and why we needed their support in reallocating resources and priorities within their companies to build cybersecurity resilience within that sector. Those meetings, I think, were incredibly helpful for all of us, because in addition to getting the top secret level, which is not typically what occurs, the top secret level briefing, to understand not just what we're dealing with today, but where things might be in the not too distant future. And then to have within a relatively small group of very senior people, senior government officials, and the most senior people in these private sector companies, is to have the opportunity to have a dialogue in a skiff, so that we could, frankly exchange perspectives and then figure out the way forward.
And what was the impact on them? They were getting classified, highly classified information about the threats. It must have had a visceral impact on them.
It did, but it was an impact. My reaction to it was, wow, we should be doing this all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the critical infrastructure in the country is owned and operated by the private sector. The private sector should be aware of the extent of the threat that they're facing, so that they can look at the vulnerability consequence and determine the risk that they're undertaking. So I thought that was incredibly effective to do. Plus, it just, to me, in any relationship that you have, what's foundational to the relationship is trust. And I always endeavor, and Alan as a leader in his sector has endeavored, to build a trusting relationship so that we can exchange views on things in a very frank way. We're not dancing around each other, and then find the best way for the country really going forward.
So you were in some of these top secret briefings, I assume.
Mm-hmm.
And how surprising was the information that you
Well, it was very targeted and very specific, and I think previously we were used to getting information that frankly wasn't all that actionable.
Yeah.
But if you really, something that I think people should really think about when they think about critical infrastructure and cybersecurity and our defense is the speed of information. If you think about intelligence that's done at the military level, trying to understand other weaponry systems of our enemies, and that's done in a time frame where you can plan for, because you're not immediately going to necessarily be at war with those weapon systems. In the cyber world, if it's out there and being developed it is likely going to be used in the very near time frame. They're not waiting for a war to be applying that. And so we have to make sure, we have to think about the speed of intelligence and being able to bring it to the actionable level much faster than we think about typical intelligence and defense.
So one of the big changes, certainly from in the last year and a half, that I'm sure you are well aware of, is that ransomware attackers have really become more aggressive, more sophisticated, more ubiquitous. They're making more money. How are you thinking about reducing that risk?
Well, reducing the risk by precisely what we're doing is trying to build resilience within the sector. And I'm in a different position than a lot of other sector risk management agencies, because I do have the authority in law to issue security directives when we deem an emergency situation exists that we need to take very quick action on. All those security directives on the surface transportation side eventually result in a rulemaking. And our goal, as we've discussed amongst us in roundtable discussions with the industry, is to continue to modify our security directive to the point that when we issue the final rule, that the last security directive and the final rule look very, very much like each other. The other thing that's a critical feature of this is, when you do an outcome based, performance-based regulation, and it's unusual to do those in the government. One of the things you want to be able to see is, hey, show me objectively the achievement of those objectives. And with our latest security directive, that's really what we're looking for. And we're not saying to any of the regulated parties, hey, this is what you need to report specifically. It's just you need to propose some regime where you can say, hey, here are a series of objective measures that determine whether or not we've achieved the outcomes. Because really what we want to be able to do across all the critical infrastructure in the country is to see the increase in resiliency across, and then step back as this is going on and say, hey, where are we most vulnerable, and where do we need to put additional effort in to get, because across the critical infrastructure there are a lot of interdependencies too, and really understanding those interdependencies. And if you see that you're dependent on another critical infrastructure sector and yet its resilience building is not where it needs to be, to put more attention into that.
As I mentioned in the open, one of the unique things about the Colonial Pipeline attack is the fact that, everyday Americans, I never know what that expression means, but felt this viscerally in many places, which usually a ransomware attack sort of flies below the radar for the public because it's a business-related issue, doesn't affect the consumer. How did that impact your response? I mean, did that create rising political pressure? Did it affect you in any way in terms of how you needed to address, communicate, and resolve some of the outstanding issues?
I would say, it's very positive, because I think too often people take their daily benefits that they have in their daily life that come from critical infrastructure.
Yeah, that's true.
You just completely take it for granted. And if you think about a gasoline pipeline like Colonial Pipeline that transports both gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, most of those pipelines, in fact, Colonial has very large storage terminals on the end of it. And so the impact is not immediate. In the natural gas industry, where you have pipelines that go directly to the power generations, and about 40% of our nation's power generation today is coming off the natural gas grid, and talking about interdependence, we don't have that storage capability with sitting right there at the market the way you do in a gas. So our industry, I would say, is even more susceptible to that immediate impact, and people would recognize it in a more wholesome way than the fact that you were inconvenienced by not being able to pick up your gasoline at the speed and pace that you normally. So it's very important, I think, from a public perspective, for people to really recognize how lucky we are to have such a stable power grid, such a stable set of critical infrastructure that we have in the U.S. here. And it's clear to me that if people could, if opponents could scare us into believing that how vulnerable that is, and all the things we take for granted, that would be powerful. Yeah. And so I think we have to take those moments and use them to really alert the public and alert the political systems that those are critical infrastructure.
Right. So a crisis is too good to waste.
Yeah. And it creates a mandate, right? I work for the American public, and the American public demanded that there be more reliability in this particular aspect of critical infrastructure. And you're right, it was mostly at gasoline stations to fuel cars, but it was also starting to impact airports and jet fuel. And so flights could potentially have been canceled. And I think that caused a lot of people to think of, oh wow, this just doesn't affect me and my own personal car. This affects me and my ability to travel around the country.
Right, right. So here we are again, a year and a half later. What keeps you up most at night?
Well, probably the things that we've learned have been on the operational, or what we call OT, so the control system, and probably the making sure that the people that we have operating this critical infrastructure, that not only are controls safe, but we are so reliant on the essential workers that we have operating that we've got to make sure that we're doing the vetting for those people. And that feels very intrusive to an organization that has always been off the radar screen and hasn't ever had any of that kind of attention placed on it in terms of the security of the workforce. And so, but that's an area that we as an industry have got to continue to press on, whether we like it or not, and whether it's popular or not. We've got to continue to make progress on that front.
What keeps me up at night is not a lot of things, because I need all the sleep I can get.
I feel ya.
But it's when I think of the risk, we still have risk across our critical infrastructure. We're bringing down the risk thanks to the great efforts of Alan, his team, and across that pipeline sector, and now across the rail sector, and soon across the aviation sector. But the risk is still very much there, and the geopolitical situation around the globe is still very challenging overall. So I worry about the risk, and then attendant to that is should something happen, and I always need to think this way, right? I'm a Coast Guard officer. Our motto was Semper Paratus, always ready. I'm always thinking about, are we ready if something happens, to how we're going to respond to it. And that's why we want to do a series of tabletop exercises and continue to work to make sure that in the executive branch we've got our processes right, and that from the companies view us as working to support them to get back on their feet and recover.
Yeah. Presumably across your whole portfolio, not
across
just pipelines.
The whole portfolio. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So we'll have time for maybe just one or two questions, but before we do that, I cannot have the administrator of the TSA on stage and not ask you, and feel free to break news. We got no problem with that. When can we bring the liquids on board?
Yeah, really good question. So, I would tell you that we're introducing a lot of new technology in our screening process. The technology improves significantly three things. It improves our ability to detect, it improves the efficiency overall, and it improves the passenger experience. And I think the passenger experience piece is very, very important. We are looking at some changes that would affect mostly our trusted traveler population, so the global entry and pre-check holders. No announcements here, but we do have more technology, and we are looking at some of those things. So
Before Christmas?
no.
I'm a journalist, I can't help it. Okay, we have time, like literally for where we'll do one, we may have one question and maybe we can get to a second one depending how short it is. I'm looking and, I see over here, yes. Why don't you shout it and I'll repeat it.
Hi, I'm Hallie Zimmerman. I'm with Northrop Grumman in cyber policy. I really appreciate you all talking about your experience with the Colonial Pipeline and how the speed of information needs to be faster. I resonate with that very much so in the policy sense. So my question is, what do you think can be done to improve the speed of policy and regulation creation in order to protect critical infrastructure for future events?
So the question from a representative from Northrop Grumman is what can be done to speed the policy and regulation in order to protect future events? Who would like to take that on? I think that's for you.
I'll take that on. I would submit as Exhibit A, TSA. I mean, we have speed. Our vision is an agile security agency empowered by a professional workforce that works closely with its partners to ensure security of the transportation system. Our authority, as I mentioned, gives us in an emergency the ability to issue directives to close a vulnerability that we see. That's a really, really good model in my view, and it's followed up on the surface side with a full notice and comment rulemaking process. So there is a process for notice and comment. I think it's fundamental to that, though, that the regulating agency work very closely with the regulated parties to determine what the best approach would be. And I think, thanks to Alan and his team and the other partners that we have that are regulated in the pipeline sector, we've really gotten a large way to that point. I am really, really happy with where we are at this point, and I just really appreciate the partnership. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, we're going to have to end it there. So Administrator David Pekoske, Alan Armstrong, thank you so much. We will await further word. Thank you.
Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.